Greetings and welcome back to Whiskey Uncorked. My name is Brian, and today we are going to be continuing our exploration of the 18-year-old single malt Scotch category by looking at what is becoming a classic in the Tomatin 18. I first bought this bottle and I started tasting it. I kind of felt like this was going to be a relatively straightforward, to the point review. There wasn't going to be a ton to say, but I've realized that there's actually a lot to talk about with this in terms of how it sits in the rest of not only the 18-year-old single malt market, but really comparing it to a number of the 15-year-olds, etc. So since a lot of the conversation today is really going to focus around the value proposition of this, which was the whole point of the 18-year-old exploration series to begin with, being that the 18-year-old age statement is really where the Scotch malt whiskey industry seems to kind of be separating. You can argue it's a little bit younger, maybe more closer to the 15-year-old age range. But the 18-year-old age range is really where prices in particular start to ramp up. And that's often coincided with a lot bigger push in terms of the marketing for luxury and limited and rare and one of a kind and all of that stuff. And so far we've talked about the Annock 18, the new Bruichladdich 18, and last week we kind of went a little bit on the opposite end of the spectrum and talked about the very affordable Glenmorangie 18. And the big question with the Glenmorangie 18 was, this is a good whiskey. There's definitely positives about it. You can tell there's some age on it. Can't really pick out too many flaws. But did it separate itself from the cheaper, more affordable 12 to 15-year-old age range? Now, in all honesty, I don't know if I did a great job of actually addressing that. So maybe I'll talk about that a little bit more in this episode. But there's a lot to be said in a very similar vein with the Tomatin 18. But since so much of the conversation today is going to revolve around the value proposition of this, and obviously referring back to some of the whiskeys we've already reviewed, why don't we just get straight into the review? So before we do some tasting notes, actually, let's talk about the bottle real quick, get you some stats on this. Now, Tomatin is located in the Highlands. It produces a range of single malts, both non-age stated bourbon forward whiskeys, as well as a 12-year-old, which is sherry influenced, as well as a port influenced 14-year-old. And then they come in with the 18-year-old. I believe they have some older expressions as well, like a 30-year-old. But their cheaper range, the non-age stated whiskeys and the 12-year-old, are both 43%, or actually all three, because there is a U.S. exclusive bourbon matured non-age stated whiskey. But once you hit that 14-year-old age statement, they do creep up into that 46% non-chill filtered and natural color category. In terms of the casking, you have to do a little bit of deduction. They don't really say a whole lot about the casks. At least they aren't super transparent about it. But the bottle says matured in oak casks and first fill Oloroso sherry butts. They then go on to give out some tasting notes in dried fruit, nougats, distinctive nut flavors, develop into bursts of tropical fruit and a rich, full-bodied finish. And then it says Oloroso sherry casks on the label. See if I can get that to focus or not. Yeah, I think that should be it there. Not too much on the back, but if you go to their website, you will find that they refer to a secondary maturation in these first fill Oloroso sherry casks, which implies that this whiskey is in fact finished, but that finish lasted more than 3 years, so that they can claim it to be a secondary maturation. Now, finishing in Scotch whiskey is a whole nother video, a whole nother conversation. Typically, I don't have a huge issue with it, especially if it's used more as a creative tool, but I start to get a little iffy when you're starting to talk about higher age stated whiskeys being finished. More so once you start getting into the 20s, the 20 plus year old whiskeys. And this is obviously their house style. They're not trying to save a cask or anything like that. As I mentioned, that'll be a whole nother video. It's an interesting conversation. And at the end of the day, if the whiskey's good, the whiskey's good. That'll be the point of that entire video, regardless of whatever debates may come up. But this is finished, if that's a thing for you. I will tell you that it doesn't come off as a finish. The flavor is very consistent. That 3 years plus of in the finishing casks really helped everything meld together. Before I get too far into that, let's take a pause and I'll come back with the tasting notes. Let's see how it is on the nose today. So right away, you can tell that it is in fact sherried. If you're familiar with sherried single malt Scotch, this nose will be fairly familiar to you. It's not a sherry bomb by any stretch of the imagination. You can tell that with them doing this extended finish, that it hasn't completely overrun the initial malt character, but it is very clearly sherry influenced. Overall, I would say there's a nuttiness, there's a vanilla, there's figs, there's a lot of things that you would probably expect, but that is also in addition to, as I mentioned, the malty character of the spirit still being able to come through and having not been overrun by the barrel influence. Now, in one of the rare cases of like agreeing with like a distillery's own tasting notes, I think on the website they mentioned apricots, and on the nose in particular, yes, there are a ton of apricots. I mentioned that, I think, with the Glen Murray review last week, where I think there was also some mention of apricots, and I did not pick up apricots on that one at all. I don't eat a lot of apricots, as I mentioned, but I have had quite a bit of like dried apricots, and that is what I'm getting on the nose here. There's also a bit of like apple and melon, kind of to contrast that. Overall, the nose is really nice. It's elegant, it's clean, it's well-rounded, it's fragrant. I don't know if it's doing anything like wow, but it's a very nice, and this is going to be a theme, but what I consider, at least in my mind, to be like a very classic, traditional single malt Scotch that has a touch of sherry influence to it. All right, let's see how it does on the palate. Cheers. So this is certainly a whiskey where the nose and the palate match up really closely. It's very mouth-watering. As I started talking, I'm still getting a lot of like saliva generation, so I apologize. But it is malty, it's fruity, a lot of vanilla all the way through. There's a touch of oak spice, barrel spice, maybe, again, it's tough to say whether it's like an Oloroso thing or maybe it's from a barrel, some European oak, Spanish oak sort of thing. And the fruitiness, I think the fruitiness on a whiskey like this is always going to be the thing that separates it, right? Tomatin isn't necessarily known for having some beefy, meaty, funky character in terms of its spirit. I've never had its new make spirit, but I have to assume that it's probably pretty fruity and easy to drink straight off of the still. All right, second sip to get a little bit more dialed in on that fruit note. Nice silky texture as well, and yeah, that melon that I picked up on the nose, is definitely coming through. This is a cantaloupe and honeydew melon with maybe a touch of like apple tartness, green apples. There is that nuttiness and vanilla is there. I think I mentioned that. There's a sweetness that is both coming from the fruity note, but there's also a really nice kind of caramel, dark caramel, maybe even bordering on toffee. I would go with honeycomb as well. I think I was going to say that on the nose and completely forgot. Yeah, it's a really rounded, even, full flavored experience that I would define as a bit elegant, refined, very even throughout, very controlled, and definitely, as I mentioned, on the nose, kind of what my brain interprets as being like the definition of like aged single malt Scotch. All right, one more sip to see if we get anything else on the finish. At that time, as I was chewing on it, there was some big melon notes on the very back of the palate. There's some oakiness throughout for sure. I think I got a little bit more on that one. The maltiness is there. There is chocolate. There's a bit of a malted milk ball sort of quality. And again, some of that spice is coming through. But everything is very in tune, very layered. It's complex, but it's not doing anything kind of weird. It's a very delicious, even-handed, well-constructed glass of whiskey. All right, so overall, what do I think of this? And it's really difficult to deny that this is an extremely tasty whiskey, right there. I've always liked Tomatin. This is actually the first official bottling of it that I have owned, but I've tasted it a number of times, including the 14-year-old, which I liked the couple of drams that I had. I was always really surprised at how much I liked it. And then I've probably tasted the 18 at some point as well, but doing this 18-year-old series, this was almost a must in terms of picking it up so I can compare and contrast it against some of the other things in the market. And the reason for that is it's not the only option, but in terms of like relatively at least affordable, like sherry forward 18-plus-year-old Scotch whiskeys, that category is shrinking pretty quickly in terms of what you can even consider to be affordable, as many of those brands that make whiskey like this have been pushing more and more towards that luxury branding. And obviously in conjunction, luxury pricing. So anyways, I do really like this whiskey. It's very easy to drink, but it's flavorful. And it does remind me to a certain degree of the Glenmorangie 18, which was all bourbon and maybe slightly less refined, maybe slightly less layered. Obviously with the sherry casks, you're getting a lot of different flavors in this, and it's probably providing at least a little bit more detail and elegance in the Tomatin, but I still did really enjoy the Glenmorangie and the peach tea note I was getting on that. So in contrast, this is more of that melon and maybe some green apple, which I love as well, but it really is going to come down to, at least in terms of the flavor profile, what your preference is. But I do kind of put this and that Glenmorangie on pretty similar levels in terms of overall quality. And the Tomatin will edge it out if you're a sherry fan and you like a little bit more to dig into, a little bit more detail, a few more layers, a little bit more complexity. But let's start talking about value. Is this a good value? Because all of that is irrelevant if this is a $300 bottle of whiskey or something like that. Well, luckily, it's not that expensive yet. I was able to pick this up locally for $127 plus tax. I have seen, I always check Chicago because I think it's a good contrast being in the Midwest, and I spend a lot of time there, so I'm curious as for my next trip whether I should look to grab a bottle. It looks like you can still grab this at Binny's in Chicago for $110, and if you can get it for $110 in Chicago, there's a possibility you might be able to find it for that or even less. But a cursory look on the internet said that this is probably somewhere in the $120 to $130 range in most places. Throw on tax and you are probably looking at $140 out the door most of the time. Now this is actually not that bad when you compare it to the UK pricing, where this is coming in at £126 per Tomatin's website. The quick translation to that is going to be closer to the $160 range. So it appears that, at least in terms of the direct monetary translation, for the time being, we are getting a little bit of a deal on this compared to the hometown residents. Now, all that's well and good. As most of us know, the prices on 18-year-old single malt scotches have been getting stretched, and some of them are completely leaving the realm of like even being in consideration for a whole heck of a lot of people. Others are really, really pushing it. let's say like the Bruichladdich 18 and the Newport Charlotte 18. And all of those aren't the most expensive, right? We're seeing this premiumization of the market, and these distilleries telling us that 18-year-old whiskey is so rare and so special. And I went into that a lot in the Glenmurray video, so I encourage you to go check that out. But in terms of kind of that, like where does this sit in the overall scheme of things, this one's a little confounding. And the reason for that is it's really good whiskey. It's nice and it's subtle and it's pretty and it's tasty and it's complex and it's all these really positive things. A lot of things that a lot of people would expect out of an 18-year-old single malt Scotch. However, I feel like maybe this is falling behind in terms of what modern day Scotch enthusiast drinkers are looking for. And really, it's kind of my perspective, and maybe I'm really speaking for myself here, but pretty and elegant and refined, that's all well and good, and I enjoy that, and having whiskeys like that on my shelf is something that I would always like. But when I'm going to pay for a whiskey, if I'm paying $100, $150 plus, I want it to do something interesting. I want it to do something different and bring a new thing to the table that is completely different from what I can get in the 12 to 15-year-old age range. And the reality is that's where the Glenmurray suffered last week, right? It's $90. It's one of the cheapest single malt 18-year-olds you can buy, period. And it's 47.2% and non-chill filtered. And it's good whiskey. But is it better than the bottles that are 12 years old and $30 less? Is it worth the extra $25-$30 on top of that? Or should you just kind of hang out in that $60-$65 age range, or price range, sorry, and where there's a ton of really, really good whiskey? Now with this, I keep asking myself that same question because it's good. But is it worth $130? Is it even worth $110 plus tax, or 126 pounds? And I'm really struggling to sit here in this camera and say, oh yeah, it's worth it, because it's not. So I'm going to pull out another bottle that it's not the same whiskey. It's different, but stick with me here. This is the Speyburn 15-year-old. It has become a bit of an enthusiast go-to, especially when you're talking about budget. Now there is a Speyburn 18-year-old, but that one seems to be climbing in price quite a bit. And I think, as I mentioned, it's not everywhere in the States anymore. You kind of have to look for it, but it seems to be hovering in that $130 to $140 range, a la the Tomatin 18. Now, the Speyburn 15-year-old is hanging around that $70 price point. It's been creeping up a little bit lately, and it's one of those things where sometimes I wonder if we're still getting like last year's pricing, because Scotch does tend to stick around on the shelves here a little bit. And that's kind of what I was wondering, maybe even with the Tomatin 18 being at Binny's for $110, where it seems to be creeping up closer to that $130 price point, that maybe they bought a bunch of it at one point and there hasn't been a bunch of turnover and they're still selling it at maybe the price it was a few years back. But that's impossible to know. The point of all this is around $70, maybe $75 plus tax. So that's putting it at somewhere $55 to $60 cheaper than the Tomatin 18. This is also a sherry forward whiskey. It's 46%. It's non-chill filtered. It's natural color. And it's also really good. Now, they're not the same whiskey. I would say that the Speyburn 15 is a little bit heavier, a little bit richer. It's a little bit less elegant, maybe a little bit extra more spicy. But depending on your flavor profile, you might actually prefer it. And I'm kind of leaning that way as well. It also helps that this is a very kind of oily whiskey. And again, I haven't gone head over heels in love with this, like maybe some corners of the Scotch whiskey community, but it is really good. And for a sherry forward dram, like it's kind of hard to not have one of these on your shelf given the price point. So it is 3 years younger, but it's almost $60 cheaper. And in context, that means you could buy one of these and a Bunnahabhain 12-year-old, a whiskey I gave an 8 out of 10, which is a very high score for an introductory introduction to a brand sort of whiskey. And You can get those 2 bottles for basically the same price, maybe for an extra $5 or $10. Then you can pick up a bottle of Tomatin 18. And that seems like a much better value at this point than picking up 1 bottle of this. So it's a great example of a good whiskey. There's nothing wrong with this whiskey, and depending on your profile, you might absolutely love this. I'm a big fan of it too, but it's just going to come down to the point of like, what would I rather have? A Speyburn 15 and a Bunnahabhain 12 or this? And it's always going to be the Speyburn and the Bunna. Just because even I think the Bunna is probably a better whiskey than this Tomatin 18, and it's half the price. It's obviously different, and this is doing its own thing, and so is the Bunnahabhain. So it's difficult to critique at least the style of whiskey. I have no problem with this existing, but it's a great example of how these older age-stated whiskeys, like leaving us in terms of price, oftentimes does not make any sense. There are times when it does, and there are times where I'm willing to shell out a significantly larger amount of money for a particular style or from a particular distillery that I have learned to love and trust, like I basically did with the Bunnahabhain, the Bruichladdich 18-year-old. Is that worth the price point? Again, probably not dollar for dollar, pound for pound, however you want to look at it. And it was an indulgence on my part, but I'm definitely getting a whiskey that I cannot find in the 12-year-old age range or lower. So at the very least, I can come away with that, knowing that that experience is going to be unique, and it's going to provide me a good experience in terms of my quote-unquote Scotch whiskey journey. And it's going to check off a box. I haven't really talked about this, but I often think of whiskey and spirits in general as just this flat flavor spectrum with an infinite number of points on it. And you can break free of I'm a whiskey drinker, I'm a bourbon drinker, I'm a Scotch drinker, and you just look at the whole thing, and every single bottle, every single brand is a little tick in the infinite spectrum of flavor. And I know that Bruichladdich 18-year-old is checking off a box that basically nothing else really can. And therefore, I'm willing to pay a little bit extra for it. I don't feel nearly as bad. This Tomatin is doing its own thing. There's not necessarily another distillery that's going to be able to recreate this exact experience for me. But once I've tasted it, or I've had it one time, or I've tried it in a bar, or tried it at a friend's house, I think I could have felt fairly comfortable even not buying this 18-year-old, and maybe even sticking with the 14, which I also thought was really good. And if you check out Tomatin's marketing, it feels like they're doing this affordable luxury thing where they want to be viewed alongside Macallan and Dalmore, but as the affordable option. And therefore, they are kind of cranking up the bottle's very pretty. It's got this nice wooden cork topper, where the Speyburn, I think the label's on kind of crooked. You can barely read it. It's a skinny little thing. It's not like, it doesn't look terrible. It's got a somewhat ubiquitous shape, but the Tomatin, even their website, right? They release older age stated stuff, 30 plus years, and there's a hint of that kind of push towards a luxury brand while not charging anywhere close to the Dalmore or the Macallan line, and at a better presentation. So again, it's another distillery that's kind of trying to straddle this line of not wanting to be budget, not wanting to protect their brand, and wanting to be viewed as a high-end luxury product without treading in on some brands that have already staked their claim and going head-to-head against them. In some ways, you can look at the Dalmores and the Macallans being collector's items, and the Tomatins you can buy and drink. And I mean, I think that does actually make a little bit of sense if you're in that sort of collector's category and investment category in terms of a whiskey fan, because you don't hear these Tomatins. These aren't going to be going on auction, at least not these 18s or the 12s or anything like that, for more than their shelf price. In fact, there's probably a pretty good chance they'd go for less. All right, so I didn't give this thing a score, and I don't include value in my scores. And again, if you're new to the channel, the reason for that is I try to judge the whiskey for what it is. I try to look at my preference. I try to look at what I think the largest number of people would put it as in terms of a scoring category, because I use the 1 to 10 scale. So everything's more of a category than a direct ranking. And then I tell you what the price is, and you can make up for your mind for yourself as to whether that's an amount of money you'd be willing to spend on a whiskey and whether it sounds even remotely like it would be something that you would like. But as to where I kind of waffled in terms of quality with like the Glenmurray and even the Bruichladdich 18, where it's like my personal preference it was the Ardbeg 10, I believe, was actually the other one I was thinking of, where I've kind of waffled in terms of my personal preference and then in terms of what I think probably most people would view that whiskey as. I'm more confident on this one, and it's going to give the same score as some of those whiskeys as in a 7 out of 10, because it is very good and it's doing what it's trying to do really well. So 7 out of 10, very good. And the question is, how much do you value nuance, elegance, and refinement? Because if that's the thing you love about Scotch whiskey, then this might be right up your alley, and you might have no hesitation paying that $130 plus tax or 126 pounds or wherever it is in your market. And I wouldn't argue with you, because it is a well-made quality whiskey. But for me, I'm always looking for a little bit more of a hook when the prices start creeping up into that $150 price range, because that's pushing it for a bottle of alcohol. All right, I'm going to wrap it up there. There's a lot more to be said about value and all of that, and I've talked about a good chunk of it already in some of my previous reviews. But this is an interesting one, and we'll see how, as I continue going through this journey and critically thinking about these whiskeys and even comparing and contrasting them to maybe some other options on the market that are a little bit younger, a little bit cheaper, like how much more are you willing to pay for, like I said, nuance or that hook, or just a particular distillery because it's rare or you don't see it very often, or whatever the reason is. But I'm going to save those conversations for those bottles, and hopefully this one was a little bit shorter today. I know the half hour is a lot, but I liked talking about whiskey. It's why I started this channel. I wanted to have more in-depth conversations. So on Mondays, they're going to be a little bit longer, and I'll try to keep the Thursday one shorter. The Aaron 10 one, I had a lot to say about that bottle. I probably should have kept that as a Monday one, but I was in the midst of the 18-year-old series, and my mind was there. So anyways, besides the point, I hope you stick with me. Check out the podcast. Again, it's up on Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon, iHeartRadio, all that stuff now. And if there's somewhere else you want it, let me know. We appreciate it. We just posted numbers 1 through 10 in terms of the Dram Face top 40. So we talked about those top 10. Lengthy discussion, 2.5 hours. But we're amateurs. We like talking about whiskey. And I hope you get some value out of it. But we'll continue to do that. And maybe I'll be doing some solo episodes. I'm not sure. I don't really have a plan for the podcast, but hopefully my brother and I will be doing a little bit of a wrap-up episode. He's got some family stuff he's doing this week, so I'm not sure if that'll be ready for next Friday, but we'll see how it goes. Luckily, I don't have millions of fans, waiting with bated breath to hear what I have to say. So hopefully you can be patient with all of that. And I do appreciate you guys hanging around and leaving comments, liking, subscribing, all the stuff you've been doing to support the channel. We're now in the countdown to a whole 200 subs, which is frankly kind of shocking, given that I really just started posting regular, serious reviews at the beginning of February. And since April's not too far away, that's a lot of growth in 2 months. And it's been fun. It's been tough. My brain sometimes struggles with the amount of stuff that I've been doing for the channel and keeping everything sorted out. But I wanted to get a library of things out there. I wanted to get a lot of thoughts and ideas and get some conversations happening. So it's been good so far. And again, you guys have made it all worth it to see that people are actually responding. But until next week, well, actually probably Thursday, where I'll try to have another quick review for you. Cheers.